Welcome back to the Profit Builder Unscripted. Today we're talking about how being a better observer of ourselves and our experience can completely transform how we live our lives. All right, let's jump in. I'm so grateful to have my guest Bill Englehart with me here today to share his story of an event that happened in his life that positively changed really how he saw his life and how he managed his career and how it really impacted so many different areas of his life. And I just think that people sharing their stories is so powerful as a way of us not letting us know that we're not alone, that we all have this thread of shared humanity that is helpful for us to know that other people have experienced some of the same challenges or struggles that we have. And I also think that it's fun to hear people's stories and how their breakthroughs have happened for them and how that can sometimes inspire and empower us in our own lives. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in and introduce Bill. Bill, thank you. Thanks for being here. Thank you for being a guest. And would you just tell, before we kind of jump in and I start asking you, start sharing your story, can you tell people just a little bit about you and your background?
Sure. Well, I'm from Chicago, Cub fan. But I spent my first career was in human resource management. That's what my undergraduate degree was in. And I started off as a headhunter, and I did that for many years. And then I moved over to corporate America and became a director of recruiting, an employee relations manager, an HR director. And finally, I ended up as an international human resources director for a Fortune 50 company where I was an expat. So I lived in London and we had offices in Spain, Norway, Germany, and the UK. And that was like the highlight for me in that career was to be able to get that job, do that job. And I was just overjoyed being able to do that. But I was about 40 years old at that time, and I'd pretty much done everything that I wanted to do in that career. And I know it would be easy to continue to do what I was doing. It wasn't like I didn't enjoy it anymore, but I just pretty much had reached the max. And for me personally, I didn't want my life to be a rerun, just doing the same thing over and over, just for the money. And I felt like I'd done very well up until that point in time. So I retired from the corporate world at 40. And then I was deciding, well, what am I going to do next? And I was very involved with my Unity Church back in Kansas City for many years, taking classes, etc. And I talked to my minister and said, I think I'd like to go into the ministry and to become a Unity minister. Because a lot of the principles that I used in business that helped me retire by the time I was 40 were principles I really wanted to share with everyone. And I felt like that would be a really, great application to be able to do that. So I became a Unity minister in 2005, graduated from the seminary, and ended up out in Marin County, California, uh, leading Unity in Marin. It had like 400 members, a very successful church, Northern California. I loved that and did that for 13 years. And then I retired from platform ministry. I still do some ministry. I write for Unity and occasionally do services or perform ceremonies, that kind of a thing. But I retired from platform ministry. And so you could really say I retired from all, what you would, consider work when I was 58 years old. And so since then, I've retired, moved to Tucson, Arizona, and life is good. So that's where I'm at now. It's
Nice.
nice and warm.
Yeah, a little bit warmer than Kansas for sure, which is where I'm at now. Um, so one of how I got to know you was when you were a minister at Unity of Marin. And I think the world of you. And it was part of, I was delighted when we had the opportunity to reconnect here in Kansas City not long ago. And I was reminded of the fact that you are one of the best storytellers I have ever known. Um,
Mhm.
from the pulpit, you always had this really lovely way of bringing message through the human aspect of just being a human being through story and bringing spiritual learnings and teachings through that. And I always admired and appreciated that about you. So I'm very excited to have you as a guest today and to share your story. And would you just, begin, tell people about what was that moment in your life, right? And you and I chatted a little bit a few weeks ago about,
Mhm.
there's lots of moments, there's lots of things that sometimes happen in our life that change us or impact us in some significant way. But what is the story that for you that you're inspired to share with us today about what was a moment that or an event that changed you in some significant and powerful way?
Well, as you said, life is full of lots of moments,
Mhm.
lots of things that, cause us to awaken to what's really up for us and how we're going to really live our lives. And I guess as I was thinking about this, uh, I'm going to come at it from a perspective of more than just an event, but an awakening that's happened. And this was, while I was still in business. But I remember being working downtown Chicago I'd been a headhunter and I got hired away from the headhunting company that I worked at. I was one of the top producers there. And I ended up going to work for Kemper Financial Services. And I was the recruiter and I was really excited and I worked really hard. And we had three recruiters and one of them resigned. She relocated. And so the company asked me to do her job and my job at the same time. I'm like, no problem, and I did it. But as I was doing it, I really started to awaken to what is my motivation. And when I was a kid growing up, I grew up in a family where corporal punishment was the rule. Hopefully it's not anymore, but you lived in fear of making a mistake, or doing something wrong because it would end up with corporal punishment. And so as I was working and working really, really hard, and I was trying to understand what's my motivation, and when I really peeled it back, it was about doing so well that I would avoid criticism, doing so well that I would avoid any kind of punishment.
Mm.
That was really based on, what happened in my childhood. So I wasn't so motivated by the joy of accomplishment as I was the fear of being criticized, doing something wrong.
So can I ask you just a question? Because it's an interesting thing when you said that you were considering or thinking about what was your motivation. And when I
Mhm.
first heard that, I thought, oh, that's interesting. Um, that one would ask that question at that point in their life. That's not a question that everybody would ask. But
Mhm.
as I hear you say that, part of you was looking at, is it true that what you were looking at was what's the experience I'm having and like kind of like just noticing what was driving you to be a particular way in your job?
I think
Okay.
that's exactly the
Yeah.
way it unfolded. And I still remember I was working so hard and I was getting promoted right and left. Everything was great. But I was, again, avoiding criticism versus enjoying the ride and feeling great about the accomplishment. And I think at one point I used to bring a six-pack of Coca-Cola to the office. And I'd be drinking, caffeine like crazy. And a particularly challenging day, and I got a headache, from all the caffeine and all the pressure that was happening. And again, from the outside, nobody would have known. They would have said, Bill, he's, being promoted, he's making more money, everything looks great. But I knew from the inside that that just wasn't right. That I was more about avoiding criticism than I was about the idea of just enjoying the accomplishment and doing what it is that I was doing.
So can I
So I'm
ask
gonna,
you another
oh,
question?
sure.
I'm
Mhm.
sorry. So how did you know you weren't enjoying it? Like besides the day that you got the headache from too much caffeine, like what was the experience you were having?
Well, let's say I'd get promoted or they'd give me a big raise and I'd feel relief. I'd be like, oh, I'm not in trouble. You
Oh,
know, I'm not doing I didn't do anything wrong. It was kind of that would come up for me versus, wow, I've really earned it and I've really enjoyed it. So I could really see those things start to happen. And one thing that's going to seem like it's out of left field, but I guarantee I will draw it back as a storyteller to make sense, is I was in Japan many years ago, and I don't speak Japanese. I speak a few words, but I was traveling all throughout Japan, and I went to this little outdoor restaurant. And when I'm at the outdoor restaurant, the waiter comes over, and I'm not speaking Japanese. I had special requirements, being a vegetarian, that I needed to be able to communicate to any restaurant I went to. And I had a little piece of paper that a friend of mine wrote in Japanese. I'm a vegetarian. I do not eat fish, chicken, or meat. And so I felt like, oh, I'm really smart. I'll just show that. So I get to this restaurant, I'm sitting down and kind of looking at the menu, and the waiter comes over and I show him a little piece of paper and he looks at it, he reads it, and then he yells out to the kitchen. This is an outdoor restaurant, so the kitchen's, ways away, and like the whole restaurant stops because I'm the only gaijin, the only white person there, and they're wondering what is going on over there. And the dishwasher ends up coming out who speaks a little bit of English. And I'm excited about that. So I show him the little piece of paper. He reads it. He goes, vegetarian, cool. And I'm like, oh, great. I'm totally set. They know. And so now I'll order, I'll just point to something. And so I do, and I'm feeling really good. And then the waiter comes back and he puts a plate in front of me, and I look at it, and it doesn't have a tail on it, doesn't have a head on it, but it pretty much looks like a fish to me. Now, I don't have the vocabulary. I don't have a little note that says, is this a fish?
yeah.
Right? So I'm like, what am I going to do now? And I'm thinking, and I call for the waiter, and he brings the guy back out, and he doesn't speak good enough English for me to get this across. So I look, and there's a koi pond that's right here in the restaurant. So I get up, I bring him over to the koi pond, and I point to the fish. And of course, the whole restaurant is watching. They wonder what the hell am I doing? And then I come over to my plate and I point to that, and then I do the universal, you know, fish. And he goes, oh, yes, that's a fish, but you don't have to eat it. And I'm like, oh my God, for those of you that aren't vegetarians, in most countries you say that and they will never bring you chicken, fish, or meat. But it just happened in the culture of Japan. They thought it was interesting that I was sharing I was vegetarian, but it didn't change anything about what it is they were going to end up giving me. And I had the biggest laugh about it. And then I also thought about it. And I said, well, how many things show up on the plate of my consciousness or in my experience? And just because it shows up doesn't mean that I have to eat it. It doesn't mean that I have to get triggered by it if it's something that's different than what I'm used to. And so hold on to that idea of getting fed something, but you don't have to eat it. When I first went to the United Kingdom and became an expat HR director out there, it was basically because I had all this recruiting experience. We're going to expand the business in Europe. First day I get there, I just put my briefcase down. I'm like, I'm finally an expat. This is what I've always wanted. I'm at my desk looking out the window. I'm like, oh, this is awesome. I'm not there 10 minutes when the head of trading, there was an energy trading company, when he came in and he introduced himself and he goes, oh, Bill, you must be the new HR person. I just want to let you know, I think you should fire everyone in HR immediately. I mean, right off this, right off the, now that was being fed something, right? And there was a time in my life, if I was being driven by fear, like I was earlier in my career, wanting to avoid criticism or anything, I don't know what I would have said. I definitely, the fear would have taken over, and I'd been, what am I going to do? But I didn't treat it like that. I remember the fish story, and so I'm like, he's giving me this experience. And he's saying, here's what I want you to do. And I told him his name was Steve. And I said, well, Stephen, you may be right. But, I've only been here like 15 minutes. And it usually takes me at least an hour to make that kind of decision. He didn't know what to make of me at that point. He was because he was used to being the bully, and he got his way. At this office and this part of the company, he was like the top dog, and nobody ever, teased him or anything else. And I think he stood back, and I said, "You've got a guy you're interviewing this afternoon. Why don't I just come? I want to see how you do it." So I go and I sit in with him, and about 10 minutes in, he's talking about the markets, et cetera, but we don't know anything about the guy he's interviewing. So I just cut him off, and then I do the interview. Just right away. I just took it over. And by the time it was done, and I walked the guy downstairs, and I came back up, I was his best friend.
Mm.
Because it was like, oh my God, you really know what you're doing, etc. And now, if I would have bought into the fear, I wouldn't have joked with him at the start. And I would have been much more, I probably wouldn't have said anything in his entire interview because I'd have been afraid of offending him. But when I knew that I'm just going to enjoy what it is that I'm doing, and I know what I'm doing, and this is a skill that I have, I was able to do that. And just an interesting side note, after he took me out to dinner, etc., I actually meet the HR department. I meet him, there's half a dozen people, and I said, let me guess who your most difficult client is. And they're all looking at each other going, I said, it's Stephen, the head of trading. And they're all like, oh my God, how did you know? And I said, well, here, all you need to know is you never have to deal with him again. I'll deal with him 100% of the time. They thought manna from heaven, it came because I said, well, alleviate all their fears and their frustrations about dealing with this one guy. And again, it was all based on approaching it from the place of just because somebody wants to dish something up to you that you don't like. And maybe that's a client, that's being totally unreasonable, or a supplier, or you're trying to negotiate for something, to be able to come at it from a place of joy and a place of mutual benefit, that can solve a myriad of problems. And a lot of it comes down to how do we interpret something that's different than what we're used to. Living in the UK, every American I meet would say, oh, they drive on the wrong side of the road. And I'm like, no, they drive on the opposite side of the road to what we do in the United States. That doesn't make it wrong. It's being able to be with people where they are and trying to take that judgment that can really get in the way of us having a really good experience with a client, a customer, a supplier. That if we're layering on judgments and saying what's right and what's wrong, that really gets in the way versus being able to be much more accepting of what is. And sometimes you do things
Okay.
and
So I have a question for you. I'm listening to you, and you started this story talking about this moment that you had as you were being promoted in your career and noticing that there wasn't a lot of satisfaction or joy in what you were doing, and that you started to ask yourself the question, what's that about? Like, why am I not finding the joy or the appreciation in it? And you shared that you had this, as you started to contemplate it, you realized that your motivator was one of avoidance of pain, or avoidance of being criticized, or avoidance of doing something wrong. Okay. So tell me, so here's what I'm really curious about. One is, and I've been thinking about this since you sort of changed the direction of the story. So I'm really curious about is, there's something that as you had that realization had you make a different choice. So what had you make a different choice, and what was the different choice that you made that had you, like, so as I listened to you share those other stories about being an expat, being, this kind of this bully guy who was the head of investing, or being in the Japanese restaurant where you realized, you had to accept that you got served something, but you didn't have to eat it.
Mhm.
Um, so if you could share with us, I'm really curious about the first part about like, all right, what was that moment? Like you had this realization, but what had the realization sort of land with you, and what did you do to shift or change that for yourself? What was the thing that had you change that, and how did it change? Because I'm hearing a little bit about like the kind of the after the effect of how you had this really wonderful ability to be able to hear or to be in situations that are not ideal situations, right? Or challenging moments where you could sort of find the grace in it. But something changed in you back then that allowed you to interact with those situations that you did then. What was
Mhm.
it that changed in you?
Well, from the outer, you wouldn't have known anything changed
Sure.
because I was still a high performer.
Yeah.
Things were going great. But what really changed was what was going on inside of me. It was the self-awareness of how I was responding to what was happening or reacting to what was happening versus responding to it. And I sat down with myself and really went back and said, where is this coming from? What is this old tape? And that's when it brought me back to my childhood experiences. And I decided I did not want to live like that. I said, that is not where I'm going to go forward for the rest of my career, living in fear or criticism, that I'm going to actually have more faith and put all the energy I have into doing the best job that I can and feel really good about it and make that be what was going to be impacting my life. And so again, from the outside, you would have known the difference. But to me, it made a world of difference
Yeah.
having that realization.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. So, as I listen to you say that, one of the things that I often think to myself is that our ability to be able to observe ourselves, excuse me, or observe as you did, those years ago, of being able to observe our thinking, being able to observe like what, you said, like, what's my motivator, but it's like being able to observe what are the thoughts running in my head, what are the pictures showing up in my head, like being able to notice how do I feel, right? Being able to
Mhm.
observe like, wow, like I'm not having an experience of joy, I'm having sort of an experience of angst, or it's not enough, like because I can relate to that. I've had to like, I have those moments in my life too where I've had to like that ability to be able to just sort of rather than just keep driving and ignoring the unpleasant feeling, like stopping and looking at and noticing the unpleasant feeling or the weird, nasty thoughts that we have in our head or the weird thoughts we have in our head. Like that ability to be able to notice gives us more choice in the moment, right? Like
Mhm.
gives us that ability, like if we can observe it, we can do something about it.
Mhm.
And I'm guessing for you, and I know this is certainly true for me, that it's an ongoing process, right?
It is. It
It's
doesn't
like
just
not one
happen and
and
it's over,
done.
right?
Yeah, like that we noticed it in that moment for you, noticing it, I would guess that once you noticed it and really started to ask the question, even though you made a choice, would you say, and I just speak from my own experience, that when I've noticed something and I've made a choice about I'm going to have a different experience or I don't want to live from that place anymore, that it's a continual process of observe, choose,
Mhm.
like and until something else becomes the more predominant experience rather than this less than pleasant experience or less than useful internal dialogue we have about
Mhm.
ourselves.
Right. I agree with that 100%. And to me, it was really be about self-awareness. And once I was aware of what I wanted my motivation to be, and be able to turn in that direction. Being a recruiter, and I know you interview lots of people, And whatever the title I had, to me, it was always about being a recruiter. And within that is really about understanding that person and knowing there's no perfect person for a job.
Hmm.
It's you understand the hiring manager, what he or she, who they are, and you're trying to figure what's going to fit in with them and their team. And then you're interviewing somebody and you're trying to find out, is that going to be a really good match? And I know some people in recruiting would, write down 50 questions and they make sure they go through every one of the questions and kind of like get an abacus out to add it all up and figure out, is this the right person? That self-awareness for me of the confidence that I'm going to be able to hear what it is that I need to hear. And I'm also going to hear what's not said.
Hmm.
Now, you hear what's not said by, I'm just having an open interview as a tech person or anything else. I know the basic, do you design code, test, debug, etc. So I can run through those kind of things. But also, I'm just getting to know that person. And if you're a keen observer of people, you'll find out what they want to gloss over, what they just kind of want to skip over. And
Yeah.
if you're just really open to having the experience, then I know exactly what to, drill down on. And again, it's not that I'm looking for the perfect candidate. It's like, okay, you said, oh, your boss loved you, and then you moved right on. And I would say, well, part of what we do is we check references. So when I give your boss a call and ask him about you, what's he going to say? You know, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, maybe we didn't have that great of an experience. But to me, it really comes down to that the joy of doing what I was doing and knowing that the right imperfect information will rise to the surface. And I'll be able to discern if this is the right match. I'll hear what they're saying. But again, I called it hearing what's not said, what gets avoided. And you can only do that if you're really in a place of confidence with yourself, with the process, knowing nobody's going to, pull the wool over your eyes. And again, that's all starts with self-awareness. So if I understand myself much better, and I'm really in a place of non-judgment about who the person is with their background, et cetera, I just want to find out about them. And I was much more apt to hire, if I was in college recruiting, some kid that had a B average but worked all their way through school than somebody who, didn't have to work at all and got an A average, but couldn't really grok what it means to work hard.
Yeah.
And so all kinds of things come to the forefront. So I think as we become more self-aware, then we become more aware when we're having interactions, whether it's recruiting or whether it's in sales. We wanted to open up an office in Norway when I was in the UK. And so I arranged a meeting with four people that were traders and their manager at a energy company in Norway. So I went over there, and I don't know what life is like in Norway for people working, but just like the self-awareness piece, we have to really be open and non-judgmental and listen. And I think any leader, anybody in sales, we have to be excellent listeners before we start selling,
Yeah.
because we don't know what their real motivation is, then we're selling something that maybe they don't care about.
Yeah.
And I remember in talking to them that what I discerned, based, and they didn't say it specifically, was they wanted to be financially rewarded based on their skills and their production versus the seniority that drove their careers in Norway. And so once I hit on that, and then I started being able to say, okay, this is how we can, this is how we reward people. And ended up hiring, them and all five of them away from their company, that night. And again, it's all about listening, and again, about not taking a pre-judgment into the situation. And that gets in the way of a lot of people, is
Mhm.
having a judgment about what's right, about what's wrong,
Sure.
instead of being just totally open
Yeah.
and being able to experience things from a different perspective. And maybe it's because I've traveled all over the world that every culture has got something different. And it's different, doesn't make it wrong. And
Yeah.
sometimes it's like, wow, that makes a lot of sense. I don't know why we do it that way.
So when you think about this, you've had a lot of years of practice of being an observer of yourself, right? But I think that becomes sort of a habit that we have. And I appreciate what you're talking about in terms of that ability, that our ability to be present means that we're not only not in judgment of somebody else, but not in self-judgment as well, right?
Mhm.
That a lot of times our self-judgment can get into our way of being present in a conversation because we've got sort of this mind chatter going on. For you, just as as a final thought about all of this, is there some tip or trick that you have about how to be more present and to be more self-aware in the moment, that allows you to get present? And then I'm going to share my perspective on this too, because I have a strategy that I use for that as well.
Okay. Well, now, first and foremost, it's about knowing thyself, that you start really looking at yourself and trying to figure out, well, where am I coming from? And how am I coming across? And am I saying things just to make it appear that I'm smart? Sometimes people aren't listening because they've got the next thing in their head that they want to say that's going to show how smart they are. If we could really peel all that back and we can just really be present to ourselves and say, well, even if you're interviewing for a job, if I get the job, then it's the right and perfect job. And if I didn't get the job, then maybe I'm delivered, from what would have been maybe a bad job for me. And so it's really, to me, self-awareness first.
Mhm.
To, and it could be after you have a meeting or while you're in a meeting. And I remember being in a board meeting once, and as I was observing everyone, I was thinking several people were like putting their feathers up like peacocks, wanting to show how smart and how important they were, instead of really getting down to let's really talk about what's happening. And so every interaction we can have it, and then we can review it by sitting down with ourselves, going into the silence and saying, how do I feel about that? Oh, how does it make me feel? How would I like to feel? And how can I get from maybe being in a place of fear to then moving over to a place of having more faith and joy? And it
Mm.
all starts with changing our mind.
Right. Mm. I like that. Change your thinking, change your life.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Just to piggyback on that for me, um, well, I would agree. I would concur with everything that you just said, and noticing the self-judgment and then asking that question of what's my intention? What's the experience I want to be creating? How do I want to show up in this situation? Um, for me, part of it is just having some mindfulness about it, before I go into a situation or interaction. Even just, I think I shared with you when we got on that started this conversation. I said I just spent some time with myself, just sitting and going, okay, what, like, being present to this conversation. What do I want to have happen here? What's the experience I want to create? What's the opening I want to have here? And not like trying to pre-frame the content of it, but more from a contextual point of view, holding the space for wanting there to be an opening and to be, to have it be serving and so on. So I think that ability uh, to just stop and choose from an intentional place is really powerful.
I
Um,
do want to interject one more thing,
yeah.
because I think it was all that preparation for all the years, all the work that I did really, really paid off when I started volunteering at San Quentin Prison. I was co-facilitating a men's group of men that were serving life sentences. And so I had fear about going into San Quentin. I'd never been in a prison before, and let alone sitting with 30 men that were all serving life sentences, been in for 18 to 40 years. But it all came back to me. It all came to me about not judging about being with people where they are right now versus where they were or where there may be, and to be able to be so open that I could call them on their shit sometimes if that's what needed to happen, but I could also show them love and appreciation and help them to recognize within themselves that they have this enormous power to redefine who they are in this moment. So by the time they end up getting out, that they'll be a changed person, not just because they were incarcerated, but because they become much more self-aware.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that starts our ability to be able to do that with other people, which is huge, especially in an environment like that, starts with our ability to be able to do that with ourselves. And the less
Right.
judgment we are of ourselves, right, the more open that we
Right.
can be with other people. Yeah. Yeah.
Amen to that.
Yeah. Bill, thank you. I really appreciate you sharing yourself and sharing your story. Before we wrap up, I'm going to ask my rapid fire questions.
Okay.
Favorite personal book or podcast?
I'd say a book by a guy by name of Robert Brummett. It's called Finding Yourself in Transition.
Yeah,
So
okay.
get the double entendre there. It is finding yourself, not just finding yourself in transition, but finding yourself
In
in
transition.
transition. It's
Nice.
it's thin book, Unity publication. It's awesome.
Okay, great. Thanks. How about business book?
I would say there's a book called The Surrender Experiment,
Ah,
and
mm-hmm.
it's by an author named Michael Singer.
Yep.
And he also wrote a book called The Untethered Soul. And
Yes.
if you really want to get it, I'd read The Untethered Soul first and then read The Surrender Experiment.
Okay.
Very spiritual guy, created an incredible business. And I remember reading the first book and thinking, oh, yeah, but he's with some hippie out in the woods who came up with all this. Then I read the next book and I'm like, oh my God, he
Yeah,
was
he's got some
facing more
cred
stuff
behind it.
than I could ever imagine. So.
Awesome. Thank you. Favorite food or meal?
Well, as a vegetarian, I'm really partial to the Impossible Burger now.
All right. I think it's pretty good. What is something that you're grateful for right now?
Right now, I'm grateful for you, Vicky. I'm grateful that we got to connect up, out at in Missouri after many years and
Me
be
too.
able to have this time together. I really
Yeah.
appreciate you and appreciate this opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. Me too. Me too. Thank you, Bill. I appreciate it. I appreciate you. Thank you for sharing yourself and your story. And for all of you who are listening, I hope you found some nugget of inspiration in this, and maybe out of this conversation that we've been having here today, that maybe you'll start to give some more thought to noticing and being a better observer of yourself, so that you can have a different experience in your life too. All right, thanks for
Amen.
being here, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time on the Profit Builder Unscripted.